Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give it just a couple more minutes for folks to join, and then we will get started. Great. Looks like we've got a good group here. Thank you again for joining us. We'll get the meeting started now. Dimitri, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this workshop on the Electrical Undergrounding Plan Draft Guidelines. My name is Dimitri. I'm a senior utilities engineer with the Electrical Undergrounding Division. Before we dive in, I'd like to start with a safety message. Go to things. Okay. So we're going to be here for a bit, so take care of your posture and sit in a comfortable position. Take regular breaks, hydrate, and rest your eyes. We're going to have 2 scheduled breaks. Know the emergency exits and procedure in your physical location should the need arise. Be prepared for earthquakes. Hide under a sturdy desk and be aware of falling objects. Lastly, if you feel something, say something, and we will do our best to find a way to help.
Great. Thank you. Next slide, please. So today, we'd like to really thank you all for participating. One of the fundamental premises of SB 884, which is the legislation that allows large electrical corporations to submit 10-year undergrounding plans, is to reduce risk sooner rather than later. So the question for us is, how do we start reducing risk sooner rather than later while adhering to the other fundamental aspects of SB 884, namely achieving economies of scale and assuring a rigorous process that considers alternative mitigations? So today we're here to propose a methodology that will balance the need to act quickly to reduce the risk of wildfire and increase reliability on the system, while at the same time requiring a rigorous approach to determining the best solution for each circuit segment. This proposed methodology allows for stakeholder review of the process in almost real time as the large electrical corporations roll out their undergrounding plans. It's data-driven so that stakeholders will also see the short, medium, and long-term effects of the plan in terms of reducing risk in a timely and measurable way. So for our agenda today, we're going to take you through the main elements of our guidelines. We do request that you confine your questions to those on these guidelines, and if you have alternative suggestions, to put those in your comments and reply comments, and we'll talk about the due dates for those at the end of the session. We've allotted a lot of time for Q&A after each section, but at the end of the workshop, we're also going to take a poll on what additional information you're interested in hearing about, because we're doing another workshop next Wednesday from 1 to 3. So if you have questions during the presentation, please raise your hand and we'll call on you during one of the Q&A sessions. And also I'm sure you all noted that this workshop is being recorded and we'll put it on our website. And we've also posted the slides there as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we wanted to start this presentation with the why of our guidelines and then move into the what and the how. And the reason is simple. There were a lot of different ways that this plan could be designed. We held 6 working group sessions last November to review all of the different facets of the legislation with stakeholders. And there were a lot of really good ideas presented during those sessions that helped crystallize our thinking around the 3 central concepts of what we had to address. So the first thing we needed to address was flexibility. We all know that things are going to change over the 10 years, and we know for sure that the models are going to change and the costs are going to change, technologies are going to change, and these will all have a significant impact on the undergrounding plan. So we needed to find a way to factor in the changes we knew were going to happen without requiring the utilities to continually resubmit plans. We're also wanting to clarify that we are not approving projects, we're approving a plan. And doing that gives us the opportunity to have the large electrical corporations come up with a framework approach in their plan that we would approve. So we're therefore approving how they're choosing their projects, not the projects themselves. The third thing we wanted to be able to factor in is that the IOUs are unlikely to have all of the information on all of their projects at the time of plan submittal. Yet there's benefits for them being able to get started on the plan, so we needed to find a way to approve a plan that did not have a perfect amount of information. The second aspect of this is data driven. Our charge as energy safety is to approve a plan that, quote, shows substantial increase in reliability and shows substantial decrease in risk of wildfire. So as we were developing these guidelines, we went through the process of defining each of these words and all the other words in the legislation. And for us, this whole phrase means a mathematical, model-driven process, not a narrative. And substantial and increase are both in comparison to alternative mitigations and factoring in the risk factors that are related to time. So, every year that mitigation is delayed, it adds risk to the system. And then finally, this is a multi-agency process. The expedited undergrounding plan is going to first come to energy safety to approve the plan based on risk reduction and increase in reliability, and then the PUC must approve the costs. So you're going to see in the guidelines that we've incorporated the elements that the PUC process is going to need as well. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Simone Brandt, one of our program and project supervisors. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. I'm going to start with sort of a brief overview of the three main elements of our guidelines, and then my colleagues will join in and get farther into the details. First, just a note on vocabulary and definitions. Appendix A of our guidelines has a very long list of definitions. Many of them you may be familiar with from other venues, but some of them are perhaps defined in a different way than you're used to. A few of note for the presentation today is that when we talk about circuit segments, we're talking about an isolatable circuit segment, also known as a circuit protection zone or CPZ. When we're talking about projects, we're talking about undergrounding projects that are being considered under this program. Portfolio is the group of projects. Standards and thresholds are the values that are used to evaluate whether a particular circuit segment should be added to the portfolio. We may say EUP or electrical undergrounding plan, which will be the plan submitted by the IOUs. As far as reliability, it can refer both to reliability as used in CPUC's cost benefit ratio, also as part of SB 884, the D2, what we call the D2 standard, which is the substantial change in reliability, which is related to outage-related programs related to wildfire prevention. And then we are using the term IOU in this presentation, although both in the guidelines and in the legislation, they're referred to as large electrical corporations. It does happen that the three entities that meet the 250,000 customer requirement are what are often referred to as the electrical IOUs, large IOUs. So we encourage you to spend some time reviewing these and the many other definitions in the guidelines. Next slide. Okay. There are three main components of the guidelines. The first is the portfolio mitigation objective. That's also what you're hearing us refer to as the D2 standard, which is whether the plan as a whole is achieving the substantial increase in reliability and substantial decrease in wildfire risk as defined by SB 884. The second component is the project acceptance framework, which is a 4-screen process used to select and prioritize projects. And then the third part is that we have quite extensive requirements in terms of data submission, model information on modeling and ongoing reporting. And that's how we'll monitor over time whether the portfolio mitigation objective is being met, as well as whether the framework is being applied as approved. Next slide. Okay, so the section of the legislation I was referring to, the D2 section, is that says that energy safety can approve the plan if the large electrical corporation has shown that the plan will substantially increase electrical reliability by reducing the use of PSPS, enhanced power line safety settings, de-energization events, and any other outage programs, and substantially reduce the risk of wildfire. So what we're referring to as the portfolio mitigation objective is sort of a combined look at both of those risk measurements, risk and reliability, and it's the overall goal for the plan. And if this objective is being met, then we could say that the D2 standard has been met. Will be set through a variety of metrics that we'll go through in depth, that look at overall risk both at the system and portfolio level. You know, in the plan, you also will be set project level standards, which will indicate whether a particular circuit segment has a high level of risk or reduction potential, although there may be reasons that a project could be selected that it does not meet those project level standards. Overall, as a whole, the entire portfolio must meet this portfolio mitigation objective. The IOU will propose the portfolio mitigation objective when they submit the plan, but in the review, energy safety may require changes. Next. Okay. The second main component is the project acceptance framework. It's a set of 4 screens that a circuit will go through as the part of the decision-making process for whether a particular circuit segment should be undergrounded. The first screen looks at eligibility. First, is the circuit segment located in an eligible area, that being a tier 2 or 3 high fire threat district or a wildfire rebuild area? And then overall, does the risk score meet one of the thresholds? You know, we have 3 types of projects based on wildfire risk, tail risk, or reliability. That will be applied at the time the plan is submitted for all circuit segments. As will screen 2, which is a project information and comparison. This will be done at the circuit segment level. It requests, but in particular, it requests comparison to different mitigation options, at least 2 alternatives to undergrounding. And it requires the CPUC's cost benefit ratio information. Well, it must be completed at the time of submission. We generalized or aggregate information may be used, since we're not expecting that all projects will be far enough along to have particular information unique to that circuit segment. Screen 3 is a more in-depth look at an individual project risk analysis. This will be done as a project is scoped and gets further along, so there's individualized risk and cost information available. This we're requiring that at least 25 projects have gone through screen 3 at the time the plan is submitted. And then others will progress to screen 3 as the information becomes available. Screen 4 is the project prioritization for all projects that have passed through screen 3. SB 884 requires a prioritization based on 4 criteria: wildfire risk reduction, public safety, cost efficiency, and reliability benefits. So screen 4 has the IOU outline how they will weigh those 4 factors and then apply it to those 25 minimum projects at the outset when the plan is submitted. Next slide. And then the third component is the information necessary to evaluate the decision-making process and modeling, validation. We'll get more into depth later on these in the presentation about what all these metrics are in terms of key decision-making metrics, risk values, model risk landscape. But we'll be looking at the system level, portfolio, and project level. And the information requested is designed to help energy safety fulfill its responsibilities under SB 884. And we've done our best to align with the cost-benefit ratio as well as the wildfire mitigation plans, although you'll see that in many cases, the information we're requesting is at a more granular level in line with the requirements of SB 884. I think that is my last slide. Hand it over to Stefan.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Stefan Shangchuk. I'm a research data specialist in the analytics unit here at Energy Safety. I'll be spending some more time with you later on to talk about specifics in modeling, but right now I would like to talk specifically about what we call the D2 standard, referring to the D2 clause in the SB 884 legislation. And the long and short of it is that this asks for the electrical companies to substantially increase electrical reliability and substantially reduce the risk of wildfire. And it specifically tasks Energy Safety with monitoring this. So I'd like to talk about how exactly we do this through a set of what we call key decision-making metrics. Next slide, please. We have to do this risk modeling to substantiate the substantialness of these mitigations. The clause also asks for a comparative analysis. And the way that we've standardized this practice is by coming up with a set of what we call key decision-making metrics. Some key facts about them before we list what ones we actually have is that we want them to be explainable, meaningful measurements of quantities related to either wildfire risk reduction or wildfire-related intentional outages. We measure these at the project level, so looking at a single circuit, at the portfolio level, so looking at a group of circuits which is undergoing mitigation under 884, and then also at the entire system level to understand the context for the substantial. Substantial is a very nebulous term, but in order for something to be substantial, you need to compare it to something that is insubstantial, for example. So we collect not only data on the very specific circuits that are going to be undergrounded or being proposed to undergrounded, but to understand the entire service territory. These various key decision-making metrics are going to be modeled for a contemporary baseline. So if we do nothing more, what would the risk be? What would be the risks that we would expect over the next 60 years, which we've defined as the lifetime of the undergrounding assets? And we will have cadences of reporting on these, which we'll detail a little bit more later on. So there are 7 key decision making metrics that we require in our plan, which relate to our conception of overall utility risk. Since we are asking them to be explainable and reported in their natural units, these are unscaled, non-dollarized metrics. And we understand that this is slightly different from the way that the PUC approaches risk through their cost-benefit analysis. So we've also built in some flexibility for the IOUs to propose up to 5 additional key decision making metrics that they think are important and should be factored into the evaluation of their plan and the substantiation of the risk reduction of their mitigation activities. Next slide, please. So I won't waste time reading out all of the definitions. I think they're pretty self-explanatory. Our 7 required key decision-making metrics are reflective of a probabilistic risk assessment point of view, where we are looking at risk as some type of product. And again, we leave flexibility whether this is a direct product, a weighted inner product, some kind of integral over a sigma algebra for the math nerds around here. But we are understanding risk essentially as a product of a likelihood of an event occurring and the severity of that event. And so we have an overall utility risk, which is a combined score of the outage program risk and the ignition risk. The ignition risk measures impacts from wildfire at a given location. Again, product of the likelihood of a wildfire occurring and the consequences. The ignition consequences, again, what the total anticipated adverse effects from the wildfire on a specific community that it reaches. Ignition likelihood will look at the likelihood of an ignition. For outage program risk, this is a slightly different definition than the PSPS definition often used in WMP because of the exact verbiage in the legislation which created this program. So this is, again, the product of 2 factors: the likelihood of an outage program event occurring at a particular location and the consequence of that event. And again, outage program is a defined term which we've inherited directly from the legislation. The outage program likelihood we have a slightly informal definition here just for reason of space. It's a little longer if you go to Appendix A and read it, but it's the likelihood of an outage program being given and also the expected time of that program. And we specifically ask for the IOU to detail how they balance out something like 3 2-minute outages versus a 10-minute outage, and we ask for some reporting on that. Next slide, please. So with these key decision-making metrics, we've essentially identified 3 different types of projects which will achieve a substantial reduction of risk. So the first and most basic type are what we call high-risk circuit segments. These are circuit segments that unmitigated exceed some type of high-risk threshold. This threshold, again, is measured only in overall utility risk. And in order to set up a success standard or a mitigation criteria, as we call it, we ask for the Electrical Corporation to define an explicit formula of overall utility risk and additional key decision-making metrics that they believe are important to establishing a successful project. Our second type of project are ignition tail risk circuit segments. And the circuit qualifies for this program by having a consequence score which exceeds some predetermined threshold. Again, all of these thresholds we have not set exactly because we need to see the context of the entire system to understand what is a good threshold, what is not a good threshold. We ask for the IOUs to present a threshold in their plan, and we will review it and potentially make modification requests depending on their appropriateness. This threshold for ignition tail risk is measured in ignition consequence. And the success likelihood here is going to be measured in ignition likelihood, plus potentially other key decision-making metrics. And this may seem a little unusual at first, but the idea that we're trying to get at here is that a undergrounding mitigation tends not to affect the consequence of the wildfire at a location, only its likelihood. So if you have some event that is very severe in consequence, but somewhat unlikely, it may have a lower risk score, especially a lower unscaled risk score, but still should demand special attention because of this high mitigation, or this high consequence. And since the mitigation only affects the likelihood, that's what we need to measure to determine whether or not that was a successful mitigation. Our last category, again, coming from specific requests from our stakeholders, is our high frequency outage program circuit segment program. These look for circuit segments which have very high frequencies of outage programs, or potentially face long-term outage programs, or many in a given time period. So this is measured in outage program frequency, which again, we have a slightly longer, more formal definition in the Appendix A that you should check out. And this one, we don't have a mismatch. We measure the success of this in our outage program likelihood measurement, but then if there are additional metrics which the IOUs believe are important for valuing these projects, we leave some room for them to propose the actual formal success criteria. Next slide, please. So we'll do a quick explanation again of each of these types of projects measured here on a risk matrix. So for those unfamiliar, there's lots of ways to do these. We right now have the x-axis as the likelihood of an event happening and the y-axis as a consequence. I should note these are example plots meant to help illustrate the concept. They are not drawn to scale, and they do not represent any formal thresholds which we've set. They're illustrative purposes only. So again, here our risk again is our product of our likelihood and our consequence. So the top right corner is high risk, high consequence, or sorry, high likelihood, high consequence events. This would be our most risky circuits. Things in the bottom left of this would be low likelihood, low consequence, and not risky. So in red, we've marked a circuit which is a high risk circuit. Then after doing some mitigation, potentially undergrounding, which only affects the likelihood of an event at of the adverse event at that circuit, you see it is moved all the way over to the left into some safe zone defined by this mitigated risk threshold. Again, thresholds that we have not set formally because we need to see all of the context information in order to set them appropriately. Next slide, please. So next, we're actually, sorry, one more thing on the previous slide, if we could. I just want to note that we are here showing this in overall utility risk. So we look at likelihood of the event and consequence of the event. This is a combined measure of the outage program and the outage program risk and ignition risk. Thanks. Next slide. So outage program risk, or high frequency outage program circuits are measured in outage program risk. So now our x-axis is the likelihood of an outage program at the circuit, and the left-hand side is the y-axis is the consequence of that program. So here we are narrowing in on these high frequency power outage or high frequency outage program circuits. So the threshold is a measurement purely of likelihood of the outage program. The success threshold, again, we haven't set a specific one, but we've drawn an example here of something that we'd like to see. We have this is a little different than the previous example, because again, we're only affecting likelihood with undergrounding. So when we measure the success of a program or a circuit being undergrounded through this program, it's important that the likelihood itself is much lower, that we don't really affect the consequence with this type of mitigation, and therefore the likelihood is the key determining factor in whether or not this is a successful mitigation. Next slide, please. The third type is our ignition tail risk circuit segments. Again, these ones are a little special because we're concerned with the consequence of an ignition at a particular circuit segment. If this consequence score is very high, then there is an argument that it should be mitigated regardless of likelihood. However, what exactly that consequence threshold is something that we need to determine, and we need more context information in the EUP in order to decide. And since we're measuring the eligibility for this program in consequence, and undergrounding only affects the likelihood, measuring success here is a little bit more complicated. And again, rather than prescribing a specific formula for success here, we ask for the electrical corporations to define a success criteria in their plan, which we will review and comment on as part of our process. Next slide, please. So now we'd like to just take a moment to pause and ask any questions on these slides that we've just gone through. And we can take comments in the chat.
I am not seeing any raised hands. Are you, or Val, are you seeing any raised hands?
No, I don't see any.
Okay. Thank you. I think we can move on then to the next section.
Great, thank you, Kristen and Stefan. So I'm Jean McKinney. I'm an attorney here at Energy Safety, and I am currently working as an interim program and project supervisor on the SB 884 project. And I talk in more detail about the project acceptance framework. So next slide. So the framework approach, we developed it because the plan covers a 10-year period. The large electrical corporations will likely not have fully scoped all the projects that they plan to do over the 10 years, plus there could be changes. So the project acceptance framework is designed to guide the decision-making process throughout the duration of the plan. There are 4 screens and they're applied sequentially. The screens 1 and 2 need to be completed when the plan is filed, and then screen 3 and 4, we're looking for at least 25 projects to go through those screens, but additional projects can be added later. So the utility will propose the details of the framework in the plan, and what we're looking for is going to be a really strong framework so that will support the finding that the plan will indeed achieve the substantial risk reduction and reliability improvement that we need to see under the D2 standard. So next slide. This is the same slide you saw earlier. I just want to give you another visual of the process. Screen 1 is really a pivotal screen that really identifies the eligible circuits. Screen 2 has a lot of information and has an alternative mitigation comparison. Screen 3 has a much more project-specific risk analysis, including looking at alternative mitigations. And screen 4 is that statutorily required means of prioritizing by specific factors. So next slide. Screen 1 starts off relatively simple. The statute is very clear that a circuit segment is only eligible if it's in a tier 2 or 3 high fire threat district or a rebuild area. And so the map on the right shows the high fire threat districts, and you're probably all familiar with that already. So this is a pretty straightforward step. And then the second part of screen 1 is to exclude circuit segments that don't have sufficient risk reduction potential. In other words, if they don't have a significant amount of risk, those aren't the ones that should be part of the program. So next slide. So this I've included on the right this risk matrix that you've seen previously. And so this is how the risk matrix gets used. And when it gets used initially, it is going to screen out projects that don't have sufficient risk. And so the large electrical corporation is going to be developing these values. And Stefan will be going into more detail on the values, I think later, as well as heard a lot about them just previous. And then, as Stefan said, there's 3 different ways that a circuit segment might be deemed risky enough to be part of the program. That's the overall utility risk threshold, the ignition consequence threshold, or the outage program reliability threshold. And the ignition consequence threshold is the one that applies to tail risk. So if a circuit segment doesn't exceed any of these thresholds, it is not going to be part of the program, and it's eliminated in screen 1. So this is a very important part of the process, because this is what determines that we're working with a pool of circuit segments that really need this attention. And to go over to the matrix again, the risk matrix. So the red X, that's the theoretical circuit that is above the red line, which is the high risk threshold. The yellow X's, one is in that yellow field, which is considered tolerable. And then the other one is in the purple zone, which is actually the mitigation. It's where we're looking for a mitigated project to be risk-wise after the mitigation. So next slide. Screen 2 is really about information and the alternative mitigation comparison. This is where we have required the utility to provide most of the information that's already listed in the CPUC resolution. SPD 15 has that appendix 1 with a long list of data. So we want that data to be part of what the utility gives us with screen 2. And then they'll do this, and that includes some information on the alternative mitigations. Energy safety will then use this because it will help us understand the potential for the plan to reduce risk and help us evaluate the portfolio mitigation objective and whether the plan is going to meet that. However, when screen 2 is performed, the utility may not have all of the information. If that's the case, instead of using project-specific information, they might be using estimates, aggregates, assumptions. For example, circuits located in a certain area, we're just going to do an estimate for their risk values and how much alternative mitigation would cost, et cetera, et cetera. So importantly, here's the type of data that we'll be looking for. So for screen 1, it's these very basic elements that you're familiar with from Appendix 1 of the CPUC guidelines. And The second screen is really the project index table, has the more specific information for a project that is needed to complete the screen 2 comparison. And this isn't all of the information. This is just to give you an example of what types of things are required for these 2 frames. And we will be getting into how data is submitted and more about what data is required later in the presentation. So next slide. So screen 3 is the project risk analysis. And to complete this, we do need the project specific information. So we need to look at it in the context of the portfolio. So to do this risk analysis, the utility is going to have done some scoping and design work where, you know, it's got to be somewhere in that process to have enough information to do this risk analysis. So once a project has reached that point, it can be put through screen 3, assuming it's already past screen 1 and 2. One of the things that's important about screen 3 that's different from screen 2 is it really incorporates that time element if there is a long delay in a mitigation being implemented. And again, we'll see a lot more about this in the modeling and data section about exactly what information we're looking for and why and how it's being used. It's going to generally help us understand how an individual project will support that overall risk reduction goal for the plan, which we call the portfolio mitigation objective. And it does use all 7 of the KDMMs, the key decision-making metrics, the mandatory ones. So next slide. So here's sort of a comparison of more about the screen 2 table and the screen 3 table with the comparisons to the alternative mitigation. So for screen 2, all of this information is required: safety benefits, reliability benefits, cost per mile, total cost, and that boils down to the cost benefit ratio that you're all familiar with from the CPUC. Then when a project's ready for screen 3, it's going to update that information with the project specific information if they didn't have it before, and then also add cumulative overall utility risk, cumulative wildfire risk, all the way out to year 60. And you will see there's other pieces of information that are required. But again, I wanted to give this now to give people a sense of what's going to be required. And then as you can see for screen 3, we're going to require this for the baseline, the business as usual situation, and then for what if we undergrounded, and then at least 2 alternative mitigations. Okay, next slide. So finally, we get to screen 4. The statute requires that the utility propose a means of prioritizing based on these 4 factors. So in the plan, the utility must propose a definition for each of these and then explain how they are going to use them to prioritize projects. And so this would only apply after a project has already gone through the screen 3 comparison. And obviously we would need more than one project in screen 4 to prioritize. So we're asking for at least 25 in the original plan, and then as additional ones past screen 3, they can do a reprioritization. And next slide. Okay, this is kind of a summary of a little bit about the screens. Screen 1 is that identify the eligible circuits, create a list of projects. Screen 2 is get that information for the CPUC, including the alternative mitigation comparison. And screen 3, the project risk analysis, is really going to allow Energy Safety to do its analysis of a project. And we would be doing this after the plan is approved. So it's key that we are clear about what information is needed and that we're collecting the right information. And We'll talk about that in a later slide. And then the prioritization of projects as required by section 388.5C2. And I also in green here added when is the screen applied. So screen 1 and 2 have to happen when the plan is sent in, when it's submitted. And then screen 3 and 4, we want that for at least 25 projects. But then over time, things may happen. The model risk landscape may change. New information may become available that would make us want to rerun screen 1 and screen 2 with that new information. And we can do that. I mean, the utility can do that. Those changes would be reported in the progress report. And then the same for screen 3 and 4. You might have changes there. So one thing we did want to emphasize is that while screen 1 and 2 may cause a project to fall in or out when it's updated, once a project has had a significant amount of work done on it and it's past screen 3, even if there's some change in the risk modeling that shows it to be less risky, it would still go forward because of the investment, unless there was a decision not to. But the screen itself would not cause a project to be pulled. And then the other things I have here is what content is expected to be in the plan itself when it's submitted. There's the narrative, there's progress report 0, which we'll talk more about, which is basically an example or a beta progress report. It's going to have a lot of information, and we can look at how it's presented and decide if that is the way all progress reports should look. And then there's data submissions, which will be talked about later. All right, next slide. I think we're up to the questions slide. No, I don't see any questions from where I am. Does anyone?
Yes, it looks like we have a raised hand.
Okay. Can you promote that person to a speaker, and then speaker, if you could tell us your name and which organization you're with.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, name's Arthur Fisher with the Public Advocate's Office. I do have one just general question. What's your anticipated cadence of updates for this process? You could go on, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, just I'm just trying to work out how you're envisaging, how frequently you're envisaging this cycle to run.
So the updates would be with the progress reports, which happen every 6 months. The need for an update would really vary if there's a new model, if there's a new calibration of the model, if there's significant new information. And there's a little more about that in the modeling section when that's appropriate, but it doesn't have to be each time.
So maybe to clarify, what's to stop a utility submitting something every 2 weeks?
Oh, it would need to be on the 6-month progress report, because that's when they would be telling us. So things that happen in between the every 2 weeks.
So okay, so the
yeah.
utility's got to bundle everything up into a 6-month report, and then
Yeah.
you review that, and it goes. Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah, and we're assuming that 6 months is plenty of time to bundle a bunch.
And then your response to that would be within the next 6 months?
So that's a great question. So the information in the progress report is then going to be analyzed through the modeling, and we're going to learn more about that in a second, and
Okay.
otherwise evaluated for, how does it fit with what was proposed in the plan itself. And I don't know if there's a cadence yet for reporting out on if we find problems or if we find things are great.
Okay, thank you.
And it looks like we have another raised hand.
Okay.
Hello, Joseph Mitchell, Mussey Reed Road Alliance. Just to follow up on Arthur's question, if there is significant new information in the updates, in the 6 months updates that will lead to major changes. What level would public input be accepted for that, and what would be the time frame for that?
Okay, that's a great question. Take a look. At the draft guidelines. So in our process and evaluation section, that's where we would have the comment period, but let me see. So right now, the comments are in the guidelines are limited to the plan itself and the modification notices and the draft decision on the plan. Energy safety itself would be able to get information, do data requests, etc. on the new model.
So in other words, once the plan has been accepted, even if the utilities come in with major changes afterwards, there won't be a public process for that, at least with how the plan's current, or how the
right, as
That's
they're
correct.
currently written. And there are some requirements for them to justify and explain in a report why they're making the change.
Okay, and we do have another raised hand.
Okay.
It's Arthur Fisher again, and I'm just trying to get a clarification. So there is no opportunity at this point in time for public or interveners to actually comment on any changes to the plan over the 10-year period of the plan.
Okay,
what-
so
that-
we
that's what
would
you're
not,
saying?
so the way it's structured is it wouldn't be a change to the plan. The plan accommodates changes to the model and certain other information.
Is there any opportunity for public input once the plan framework, etc., has been approved?
Energy safety has not structured it that way. Kristen, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you've covered it. There would be comment on the annual report that's being done by the independent monitor. And just to reiterate what Jean is saying, the projects could change, but the plan itself would not, which means the steps that are mapped out, the 4 screens, would not change. The mitigation objectives, all the thresholds, all of those are approved in the plan, and none of those could be changed.
Understood, but any major changes by the utilities that you review don't have any opportunity for public input beyond the 30 days that you're setting for the plan initially. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, thank you. So to clarify, that will put all the opportunity for public input onto the commission's elements of this plan, of the project approval.
And I'm sorry, can you?
So you're approving changes to the plan, but then the utility is going to have to go to the commission for approval of those changes as well, aren't they? Ultimately, it's not. This is
Okay.
So and there will those will come likely to come as an advice letter to the commission, which give opportunity for stakeholders to provide
Okay.
input.
I'm not sure I agree with that entirely,
Okay.
but I can see this is a great time to say that the clarifying questions are what we're looking for here. And so I really appreciate those. And then we are going to be looking for comments on the guidelines, and this may be an area that you'll want to address.
Okay.
Thanks.
And then we do have another hand.
Okay.
Hi, Henry Burton with the Public Advocate's Office as well. So I just trying to understand how energy safety's draft guidelines will interact with the CPUC's guidelines that were adopted in January, I believe. Has energy safety spoken with or collaborated with Energy Division and Safety Policy Division about the implementation of 884?
Yes, we have spent quite a bit of time talking with them, especially around Appendix 1 and making sure that information is part of the plan. I know there might be some adjustments to the PUC list, but the basic idea is we're getting all of that information as part of Screen 2. So it will be in the plan when it goes to the CPUC, and then the CPUC is when it has the application with the plan, will be looking at cost recovery and
So
how to go
Wait,
about that.
what will be in the plan when it goes to the CPUC?
All of the information for Screen 2. So
Okay,
they'll
but
have
the
that information
CPUC
about the circuits.
The CPUC's guidance adopted in January is
Correct.
asking for is asking for a specific set of projects, a list of projects with locations and analysis supporting each project. And you're making it pretty clear that energy safety isn't intending to review and approve projects. So that seems like a fundamental mismatch in the way that the two agencies are approaching this.
Okay, so going back, Screen 2 has all of that information on the projects. And
No, wait a second,
from that
though.
pool of
just said that
projects,
hang on a second. How can that be? Because you just said the utilities can change out projects every 6 months through the duration of the
yes.
plan.
So, Mr. Burton,
You can't approve projects and then let the utilities change them every 6 months with no review.
so that
The
you
list
can,
of projects that are in the first screen are the list of projects that are in the plan and have all of the information from Screen 2 and Screen 1. They have to meet a certain threshold. So that threshold won't change when the utility decides to not pursue a project or to pursue another project. So all of
okay.
that bucket of projects is going to remain the bucket of projects.
Let me put this a different way. In your view, is energy safety reviewing and approving projects or a plan?
We are
A plan.
approving a plan.
And because of that, the utilities will be able to add, subtract, and change projects throughout the duration of the 10-year plan.
Yes.
And also
within
because
a
of that,
limited parameters.
and also because of that, interveners will have no opportunity for comment on the changes through the duration of the 10-year plan.
That's currently the way the guidelines are structured.
Meanwhile, the CPUC is asking utilities to submit a specific list of projects with project level analysis to support it as part of
So,
the application.
Mr. Burton, I'm just to go back again, that list exists and is part of the plan. So unless there's a different clarifying question, I think we should move on. Or if Kristen or Jenny wants to add something.
I don't have anything to add.
Jenny Reed, it looks like she has her hand raised. I don't have the ability to promote somebody, so
And then Joseph Mitchell has another question as well.
how come I don't see the raised hands? Okay, so Jenny's having mic problems, then we're going back to Joseph Mitchell.
There we go. Okay,
Thank
yes,
you.
just to clarify, when you say there's a list of projects, and that's what constitutes the plan, and the projects can change, does that mean that the list of possible projects is within the plan, but that the utilities have the option to remove them or switch a mitigation or whatever for that list of projects, and that list of projects is set? Or can projects move in and out of the plan? That's what's not clear to me.
Okay, in general, it's the first one, which is there's a pool of projects and it's been looked at from a risk perspective to narrow the pool of projects. It has all that information that's required for the analysis. So from that list, the utility may decide to move forward with different projects within that. And then the ones they move forward with will go to screen 3 and screen 4 before construction. Where things could change is if there's a new model that somehow changes the risk numbers for the original list of circuits that would cause some of those circuits to no longer be considered risky enough and other circuits to now have high risk scores that they should be considered. So basically, if the risk scores wind up changing through modeling.
Okay, and in that particular case, if new projects that had on new circuits that had never been evaluated yet showed up higher in this new model, they would then appear within the plan. They could be moved in within this structure. That's correct?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
And I see Arthur has another question.
Thank you, Kristen. I really appreciate that. These really are just clarifying questions at this point. So the way I'm hearing it, you would anticipate the utilities to be submitting projects that cover a greater amount of risk reduction than the actual risk targets. So the bucket of projects is going to be bigger than the target you're aiming at. Is that so you can pick and choose between the projects ultimately? Is that what you're asking for?
You can pick and choose between the projects as long as you're going to hit that portfolio mitigation objective, which is the substantial reduction of wildfire risk and substantial increase in reliability due to the decreased use of outage programs.
Which would
And
need
we'll
to-
be
Go on,
talking
sorry.
about that more in the next segment.
Okay, and then I just want to ask one clarifying question around, so running through a scenario, what would you anticipate the process be if HFTDs changed?
That you go back to screen 1 and you have the new fire threat maps, and you may wind up with, if they expand the districts, there may be additional circuit segments that need to be looked at and could be considered.
If we decide to remove districts?
Then same thing, if it hasn't already progressed into screen 3, if it's only done 1 and 2, then we would take it out, or
Okay,
it
thank you.
should be taken out.
Thank you.
I am not seeing any more questions. We still have time, so if people have questions, please.
I
feel free.
do see a Q&A from an anonymous attendee. For screen 3, can you further explain what is meant by applying and reapplying to a batch of projects? So because we need to, our baseline assumes no SB 884, that's going to slightly change as things go on. And with screen 3, you need to have a bunch of circuit segments to rank them, basically. And then for screen 4, the same thing. And so they would just happen with the updated progress reports.
Just to add that one of the reasons that we're asking for at least 25 projects in the plan itself for screen 3 and 4 is to make sure that the screen works when it's turned in by the utility. So if there are no other questions, we can take a break early. We were going to schedule a 15-minute break, and so it's 2:05. We'll be back at 2:20. Thank you. Okay, Stefan, start when you're ready.
All right, thanks everybody. As promised, I have returned. Next slide, please. And we'll spend some time now doing a little bit deeper of a dive into the modeling. And let's go one more slide. So our risk modeling methodology that we're basing our approach on is going to be a landscape analysis based primarily on a probabilistic risk assessment framework. And kind of the key idea behind this is not to have a single summary number, which we say, above this number, high, bad, this number, low, good, but to understand the totality of the risk landscape which the distribution system faces. And so in order to do that, we're not requiring, a separate system from the CPUC's CBA framework, but instead looking for some of the inputs into that before they go through dollarization, scaling, and other operations, which makes it more difficult to perform a traditional PRA type assessment. And so our methodology then is based on gathering the information in its natural form at the granularity and in the units which are most explainable, most interpretable, and which will be most useful for us. So here on this slide, I've provided an example risk modeling methodology. It does point out a bunch of the KDMMs that we require, but it also has kind of this additional factor of a weather model, just kind of trying to show what this would mean for an entire risk modeling system, not something that we are prescribing. And so it is very likely that a lot of the quantities that we are interested in tracking are not best represented by some average value or expected value or mean value, but in other forms. So something like high wind likelihood, generally not a normally distributed factor, something that's much more likely to have some kind of exponential distribution or some kind of power law scaling. Similarly, ignition likelihoods are not particularly normally distributed in our experience, and something like a risk matrix is again not even a single dimensional thing, but a two-dimensional, at least if you're just looking at ignition risk or outage risk, or you could think of it as a four-dimensional thing where ignition and outage are orthogonal or some kind of combination. And we're not prescribing which one of these is best, but we are prescribing a system for reporting the risk modeling, which details this and allows us the granularity of data we need to perform a probabilistic risk assessment in an explainable way. So again, these are not prescribed types, but here are kind of some example types that we might see, things like normal distributions, exponential distributions, risk matrices. Very possible that we end up with some kind of unitless score if there is some kind of attitude function applied towards some type of risk or some type of consequence. And so this is a little different than the way that energy safety has asked for data in the past. And so that necessitates a little different process for the verification of the risk modeling system. So before we see any actual data, any numbers, energy safety will be performing a verification of the risk modeling system. Next slide, please. And this verification process is based almost like a peer review would be for a model in a paper or in an academic context. So for each of the submodels, so we had a bunch of different submodels on the previous page, we asked for a specific report with the following sections. So we first want to know about the model usage, its scope. Is it being applied to only part of the system or the entire system? How often is it invoked? What sections are we measuring? We ask about the model taxonomy. Are we doing some kind of physics simulation of a fire burn? Are we doing a mathematical model based on some kind of probability theory? Is this a machine learning classification algorithm? Are we doing an actuarial table workup? Kind of what is the overarching taxonomy of the model? The next section will be on model inputs. What are the data that is fed into the model to produce the model's recommendations, including a description of where the original data is coming from, and if it's openly available, non-proprietary, where it can be found. We ask for information about the model solution. Essentially, the model solution could be very different depending on the type of the model. It should be calibration data, training data in a machine learning context. It could be, simulation. If we're, how are we deciding the input parameters? How are we optimizing a nonlinear objective or a non-convex objective potentially if it's a operations research kind of OR model, or essentially for the solution, we're looking for the mathematical justification of the formulas used within the model, not the exact formulas. Next, we'll be asking for the outputs, how the data produced by this model is either fed into other models or into some kind of decision-making framework. So how are we using this these outputs within our model methodology? And what are the types of outputs that we are likely to see? Next, we have a section on uncertainty, which we define as the amount by which a calculated value might differ from the true value when the input parameters are known. So we're wondering here about noise in the input data, noise in the output data, uncertainty and randomness used in the solution of the data, sensitivity of the data to small perturbations in the inputs, your typical uncertainty quantification type questions. And then kind of the last two are a little more than what we ask for in the WMP. We're asking for Troy problems, essentially giving us not necessarily real data or synthetic data, but descriptions of what level, what magnitude of input values give us what magnitudes of output values. One of these should lead to kind of a low risk score or a low probability score, low consequence, kind of low, medium, high, depending on the context, to understand what the model outputs under different conditions. And finally, the shelf life of the model, the expected length or period that the model is expected to be valued. Is it going to be updated with new calibration data next year? Is it going to be replaced by an entirely new version 3 years down the line? We'd like to upfront this information as much as possible in order to properly verify the models. And I do not have a specific slide on this, so yeah, sorry. We do have a very specific language in the guidelines on the difference between model calibration changes and model versioning changes. Model versioning changes essentially trigger a new round of this type of reporting, which will be reviewed by Energy Safety. Additionally, we require retention of models and retention of calibrations. And when a new model version is brought online, we require a backtesting regime saying what that new model would have said about our old model or about our old calibrations in order to understand how the modeling changes over time. So anytime there is a new version of a model or a new version of the risk model system, we can compare how that version differs from our previous version. Next slide, please. Again, this is based on a model risk landscape approach. We define the model risk landscape as the collection of all inputs, outputs, and intermediate calculations used in the risk modeling methodology. I have put some kind of more formal mathematics on the following slides. If you don't have a background in math, it's not particularly important. We'll explain everything in plain English. But I imagine that in the audience, there are people like me who've inhaled a lot of chalk dust over the years, and the formulas just make the concepts more clear. So I will kind of give a warning that we are not prescribing anything with these formulas. We are trying to, again, like our earlier figures of the risk matrices, we are looking or we are attempting to explain the requirements, which may be easier in these model or using these formulas. But in the plan, we ask the electrical corporations to formally define these processes and provide example calculations. Now specifically on the model risk landscape for this next set of slides where I will be talking about the core capabilities of our or that we demand for a risk modeling system in order to substantiate the substantial increase of reliability and decrease of wildfire risk. We use this notation where we say the MRL is going to be this collections of inputs and outputs. So could we actually jump back 2 slides real quickly? So our MRL is going to be this whole collection of things here on the right of scores, risk matrices, potentially distributions, average values, kind of everything that we know about the world. Under some set or of the modeled world under some set of input conditions. So back to the MRL slide, if we could, to ahead. Thank you. So the kind of key concepts for understanding this is, first of all, the version of the risk modeling system. So this refers to the overall architecture of it, which models have which types of inputs, which types of outputs. So this will be the first argument here. I've highlighted it in yellow. The next part is the calibration. So this is our set of the scenario calibration depends on what training data we've added in, what historical data we're looking up in an actuarial. This is our kind of lower level, has not changed a versioning, but may change specific calculations based on new real world data. The next argument is the portfolio. So the portfolio is the set of projects which we are modeling. So a baseline model risk landscape would have no projects in year 0, or if we when we establish a new baseline, and I'll have another slide on baselines later on, but say in year 5 we establish a new baseline, any projects which are finished will be included already in this model. Anyone that are currently in construction should be modeled as they finish, but we would assume no new projects in that portfolio, which I will use the uppercase P for in the formulas. And finally, the last part is the forecast time. Again, we don't prescribe exactly how time has to be modeled, whether it has to be a continuous variable or a set of time periods, be it daily, monthly, yearly, quarterly, however that's being done. But we will require this temporal component. And kind of some notes here that I've put on the right, again, to help those who are more mathematically inclined. Again, this is a nonlinear scheme designed to understand the dependent nature of the products on the other and nonlinear effects of modeling. So some notation that we use when we look at, say, minus sign inside of the MRL parentheses. So in this first example, that means set difference. So if I say P minus A, I'm not literally subtracting the MRL of the whole project and then taking away the MRL of the 8th project. What we mean by that is you remove the project A from the set P, then run the MRL and understand what that risk is. So inside of the arguments, we're looking at set differences. when we compare to MRLs, we can't just do subtraction. If we have two normal distributions, for example, we wouldn't want to just look at the difference in their mean. We would also be interested in their distributions, and something like a KL divergence would be more appropriate. Similarly, if we're looking at two distributions which are not parametric, the appropriate distance metric would be some kind of computational optimal transport, not just a straight subtraction of means or a comparison of higher order moments. And so, again, getting very nerdy mathy here, when we look at the differences between them, it's a sign difference under some kind of potentially weighted Frechet norm that we make these comparisons. Again, really emphasizing the probabilistic risk assessment approach towards risk mitigation. Hopefully everyone hasn't fallen asleep. Next slide, please. Yes, before we get to core capabilities, I did just want to take a moment to talk about the difference between this approach and the cost-benefit analysis that the CPUC has implemented through their rulemaking process, R2007-013. We are not asking for a new system. We are instead looking for the IOUs to report on their risk modeling methodology with some upstream numbers before the numbers go through things like risk scaling, dollarization, interest over time, and similar things which can obfuscate the interpretable and statistical quantities that we are interested in collecting and validating. So kind of the base, so again, none of these numbers are new. They're just numbers which we are requiring to be reported in a new way. This is in no way adding any kinds of requirements to develop new models or develop a separate system, just a separate way of showing your work for arriving at those cost-benefit analysis numbers. Specifically, we're requiring metrics to be reported in natural units and at a finer spatial and temporal granularity than the CBA approach, and without any kind of risk attitude scaling applied to consequences or risks in order for us to conduct our probabilistic risk assessment. Next slide, please. The risk modeling methodology, there's a lot of reporting. We'll talk about some human eye friendly reporting in a little bit, and we'll talk about the extensive data reporting that we ask for at the very end. And it may seem like a lot, so we've tried to boil it down into 6 core capabilities. If a risk modeling system can achieve these 6 capabilities in a meaningful, verifiable way, then all of the reporting should be easily accomplished through these operations. So the first is a project level risk analysis, so giving us the ability to directly compare projects and understand the benefits of projects. The second is an aggregate risk analysis, looking at intermediate and macro level effects of not only individual projects, but groups of projects and how they work together to achieve this overall portfolio mitigation. Our third capability is ignition and outage risks as separate and collective risks. Again, looking at some how different ones of the different key decision-making metrics apply to different aspects of risk and how they interact with each other. Part 4 looks at future risks and the accumulation of risk over time. Again, really understanding how the timing of mitigations affects the overall risk landscape. Very, very often what we observe in general probabilistic risk analysis is a less perfect mitigation done earlier ends up being more effective over a long period of time than a more instantaneously effective program implemented years down the line after you've accrued risk and had potentially adverse events happen. Core capability 5 is the establishment of baselines and historical calibrations. I mentioned this earlier, looking at how if work stopped now, or we only in some year we stop doing any more undergrounding projects, how that would affect the risk, and how we evaluate projects which may not be may not even seem relevant until several years into the program, when there's been particularly dry winter or particularly hot summer, or some update to our high fire threat district maps or similar things. And finally, again, statutorily required comparisons with alternative mitigations, looking at how one particular circuit or a group of circuits could be affected by different types of mitigation, such as covered conductor, fast curve settings, and perhaps future technologies that 9 years from now or 10 years from now we haven't even thought of yet. So for each of these core components, we require a narrative section for the IOUs to explain how they perform this capability, and giving us some toy problems with example calculations to understand what the mathematical process is. So let's go ahead and jump in. Next slide, please. Project level risk analysis. Again, the IOU must demonstrate its framework that can analyze risk reduction of projects in the portfolio, both as separate individual projects and as a collection of projects. And in order to do this, we ask for a collective analysis, a separate analysis, and what we call an ablation study.
Hey, Stefan.
Yes.
We do have a question in the Q&A, and Kristen, we'll just wait till later. Sorry.
All right. Yeah. Well. Yeah. Sorry for ignoring the question. We'll circle back once we get through the capabilities. So again, we have 3 types of analysis: the separated analysis, which looks at only the model risk landscape if only project, say A, were applied; a collective analysis, which looks at the entire portfolio of projects being applied together; and the ablation analysis, which looks at what if we did all of the projects in the portfolio except for this one. And again, the purpose of this is to adequately capture the collective, potentially dependent or non-linear effects of projects on each other. So next slide, please. We have an illustration kind of showing what these 3 studies are. So we'll look at this kind of diagram a couple times, so I'll take a little time to explain here. Essentially, the grid here, as we've put it, each box represents a bunch of circuits. Again, not really the topology that we would expect of an actual electrical distribution system, but trying to illustrate the concept. A separate study studies a single project. So here we've shown just a single undergrounding project here in green. Again, it looks at the project if no other projects are added to the, or if no other projects are being done. The collective study measures the effects of a singular project along with the rest of the portfolio. So for every project in a single portfolio, their collective studies that don't have to be separate. They should all be the same. If they're not all the same, then there's a problem with the risk modeling system. And finally, the ablation study, where we look at ablating the project from the portfolio of projects and understand how this project affects other projects. A kind of key area where this can be important is looking at something like an outage program. If you have only a single circuit segment connecting, or a single circuit segment connecting some region, if there's a PSPS called on that circuit, everything downstream of that circuit will be have a PSPS as well. And so whether or not that those downstream circuits have been undergrounded doesn't really matter if that upstream circuit gets turned off. And also the converse is also important to know and captured by this ablation study. Next slide, please. Next, we're looking for some kind of aggregate risk analysis. So understanding how individual circuit segment risks are added up or aggregated into some kind of larger risk for a region or for the portfolio footprint. So looking at all of the projects that are in the portfolio, and then also seeing how that relates to the risk on the entire system. So again, the exact way that this happens depends on specific aspects of the risk modeling system employed by the IOU. I've kind of written the notation here, assuming that the MRL measures the entire system. So at a project level, you're essentially looking at restricting it onto a single circuit segment, which I've called omega here. A portfolio level measurement could be a restriction of that MRL to the portfolio, or with justification if the preferred way to do this is to look at a union of projects or an integral over a specific part of the graph. These are all acceptable again. However is justified in the plan is acceptable as long as it is mathematically sound and statistically tractable. And again, yes, the notation that I've been using assumes that the MRL is evaluated on the entire system. So we could, if we could reverse this notation and have the same concept. Next slide, please. Again, maybe for those who haven't spent tons of time in math classes, this might be a much easier way to understand this. We ask for project level information, what we've shown here in green. So just understanding what's going on a single circuit. We have portfolio level information, looking at all of the circuits in the portfolio, but nothing outside of it. And lastly, the system level information, everything in the electrical system. And in terms of the way that we collect this data, we'll talk about data collection in more detail later. But for each project, we develop a project reference sheet, a nice human eye readable way to understand the efficacy of a single project. That'll report both project level information and portfolio level information. We also have a portfolio cover sheet, which looks at the more macro effects of the program at the portfolio level and the system level. And again, human eye friendly way to understand this information through the portfolio cover sheet. And finally, we are also doing extensive data collection through a tabular submission, a JSON submission, and a spatial data submission, which captures all of the information on these reference sheets and additional information that is too granular for just a human eye or human mind to just look at a spreadsheet and understand, but is useful for kind of modern big data applications. Next slide, please. So core capability 3 is ignition and outage risks as separate and collective risks. We asked for the Electrical Corporation to detail its method for evaluating ignition risk and outage program risk through separate and combined metrics. We essentially, if we define the set I to be the set of metrics which measure ignition risk, O to be the set of outage program risk metrics, we require that the intersection of these sets be non-empty and the union also, or the mutual union also be empty, and understand how exactly these ignition and outage risks are balanced against each other in an overall utility risk score. So again, I think there's a next slide, please. Here's a visual representation of the idea. Again, we have a Venn diagram of metrics that are interested in wildfire risk, metrics that are interested in electrical reliability. There are some metrics which are a measurement of both. For example, something like an equipment risk, not a KDMM that we have required, but certainly one that we would be open to reviewing as part of an EUP submission. We'd like to know what metrics go with what ones, how are they combined into an overall risk score. Next slide, please. Core capability number 4 is future risks and the accumulation of risk over time. Kind of following best practices for public investment, we'd like to model the effects of these activities over the expected lifetime of the equipment, which we have currently defined as 60 years. There are certain types of these quantities that are accumulative, something like a likelihood. If we have a 1 over, actually let's not do math, but if we have a likelihood in 1 year and a likelihood in the next year, it's not just the direct sum of them that gives you the likelihood of an event happening of one or more events happening in those 2 years. You want to, of course, apply best practice statistics for this if you are using a likelihood-based model. If you're using something with a different sigma algebra, you could write this as an integral. If you're writing this in more of a functor context, it might make sense to write this mathematically as a union. But the basic idea is understanding that there are certain types of quantities like likelihoods and risks, which accumulate over time. We would like the electrical corporations, or we require, I should say, the electrical corporations to report on how they model this accumulation, how they account for it, and then making approximations through the lifetime of the program. Again, we understand that a risk projection 50 years into the future may not be particularly accurate, but we believe it is important for understanding the risk modeling system and verifying the activities which are conducted under this program. Next slide, please. Core capability 5, establishment of baselines and historical calibrations. Again, the IOU must demonstrate how it ensures that the risk modeling methodology is kept up to date and how comparisons between projects in later years of the programs are compared against a present baseline instead of some historical baseline. However, we do require the retention of models and model calibrations so that when a new version of a model is introduced, there is a sufficient amount of back testing to understand how this model differs from the previous model. And so on my math slides, our original baseline would just be looking at, again, how it depends on how we're accumulating this over time. Saying what happens if we have no projects, If we want to establish a new baseline in year 7 to evaluate a new project, we should make sure that we are including all of the projects which have already been completed and any project which is currently under construction, and model it being completed in the appropriate year in this model risk landscape calculation. Next slide, please. So again, as we get modeling updates to the version, calibration updates to the calibration, or finished projects. So if a line is successfully undergrounded, that changes the risk landscape of the system. There will have to be an establishment of this new baselines. Old baselines will be recorded and used to establish model reliability over time and measure risk reduction over time. New baselines will be used for backtesting projects and evaluating new projects. And of course, new projects should always be evaluated on the most recent or the newest baseline. Next slide, please. Next, we have comparisons with alternative mitigations. Again, we in the guidelines require at least 2 alternative mitigations for each project. We want to see the model risk landscape using the same versioning and calibration as the project is evaluated under, and we ask for both a separate analysis and a collective analysis. So for the separate analysis, we're saying, what if you did no other projects, only did this alternative? How would it affect the landscape? The collective analysis, which looks at what if we replaced the undergrounding project with this alternative mitigation. And on the next slide, I have again some pictures trying to illustrate it. So here, green is our undergrounding project. The separate analysis asks for just the single one, the collective, our portfolio of undergrounding projects, the ablation, the study of the rest of the portfolio with a project removed. Then the separate alternative analysis is analogous to the separate single project. The collective analysis looks at the portfolio, take away the undergrounding project, replace it with the alternative. This gives us our collective alternative analysis. The ablation analysis for an alternative mitigation would give us the same ablation analysis as the original project, so we don't require it here. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is my last slide on this section. I'm sure we will have questions.
Hi, yes, so Arthur Fisher has questions.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, thanks.
Great, thanks, Kristen. Okay, where do I start? Can we go back to slide 36, please? Hi there. Can you just provide a little more information on what you mean by natural units, and then also explain a bit more about the finer spatial and temporal granularity you're using? I just want to understand what you actually mean by both of those terms.
Yeah, no problem. So natural units, 2 key concepts. One, not dollarized, the units of the model, and 2, natural units being one being the maximum that model or metric could be reported in, and 0 being none. So something like a likelihood, natural units are 0 to 1.
Okay, so it might be a scaled probability or whatever the model is spitting out, as long as we understand what the maximum is.
The maximum possibility for that.
Yeah.
So it's not the maximum that the model achieves, but the maximum that the model could be.
So it's the sum of the landscape.
I'm sorry, I had an internet connection.
So it's the total, it's the maximum value in that landscape.
The maximum value of that dimension of the landscape.
Okay, thank you. So they aren't. So that's a unit of the model. That's not a unit that is necessarily intuitive to the public. Or would you say it is?
I would say that they tend to be more intuitive. They are certainly not always
More intuitive
but
than
they're
more
the most
intuitive than what?
tractable, which is the key here.
More intuitive than what?
More intuitive than $2,003 adjusted for a particular risk attitude.
Okay. And then, okay, can you provide a better explanation of what you mean by finer spatial and temporal granularity?
Yes, we're looking for project level information for each of these. Which
And how are you defining project?
Project is a activity on a single isolatable circuit segment.
So the actual unit is a circuit segment. That's
the atomic unit. Yeah, the atomic unit.
The atomic unit is the circuit segment, but the project itself may occur at a smaller unit. It'll occur at a meter scale. You know, you're not going to underground a whole circuit segment. You're going to do some portion of a circuit segment. Yeah.
Yes.
So you're actually losing. You're actually losing granularity from what the utility is actually going to be doing, because you're modeling at the circuit segment level, but the project is going to be a subsegment, occur at a subsegment granularity.
I think we're talking past each other.
Okay.
Suppose we have a circuit segment where undergrounding half of it. Another option would be to underground 3/4 of it.
Mm-hmm.
You could report those two activities at the circuit segment level. We would get different values based on the different lengths that we're undergrounding, provided that the modeling was done correctly.
Okay, so you're saying for the same circuit segment, okay, and we'll just use this as a tinker toy example for a second, so to help me understand. So you're saying that for the same circuit segment, say it's 10 miles long, one project could underground 5 miles of it, one project could underground 10 miles of it. You could report them at two separate levels. You'd get different risk reductions. You'd get different cost benefit ratios. And you would expect to see, you would treat those as two different projects.
I think we need to clarify here a little bit that when we say project, we mean the circuit segment.
I understand that.
And so the term you would be using would be the PG&E term sub-project within the
I'm
project.
just trying to understand what a project would look like and what an alternative project would look like at this point. So for the same circuit segment, you could have multiple projects identified with different risk reductions and different costs, and there would be different mileages. And those could be, you could have multiple versions of a project on a single segment. And I'm just trying to understand how that would work.
Yeah, so in the terminology we've presented, we wouldn't call those different projects, we'd call those different versions of a project.
Okay. But your grain is at the project level, and you're using mileage as a variable associated with that particular project. Okay. Okay, thanks. Can we go to slide 37, please? Okay, well, you talk about mitigation, comparisons of alternative mitigations a little later on, which is the one I wanted to get to here. So, can we go to slide 42, please? Can you explain try and explain to me how your conception of ignition risk marries to the existing conception of ignition risk that utilities use? Because I'm not following what you're doing here.
So here we're looking for more specific reporting in how the utilities quantify their overall risk scores as being a combination of ignition and outage programs. We're again taking a fundamentally probabilistic risk assessment point of view, which means a risk is a consequence times a likelihood. And so we would, I'm sorry, has that answered the question or have I missed the question? I think
you missed it. You kind of missed it a little bit. What I'm trying to get at is how you conceptualize what an ignition risk is. What is actually your unit here? What is the fundamental atomic unit of an ignition risk?
So an ignition risk applied to a single circuit would be the likelihood of an ignition occurring on that circuit segment multiplied by the consequence. And that could be modeled in several different ways, which we haven't prescribed, whether it looks at a sum of scenarios or the integral of a probability distribution of those scenarios or something else. But I have a feeling I may not answer the question.
No, it's getting in the direction. So it's a likelihood. It's basically the likelihood of an event, a single event occurring, which is basically a count of ignitions. The thing I'm just trying to understand is how you anticipate dealing with the interactions between ignition risk and outage risk, in that you have a missing information problem, because your outage programs actually lead to a gap in the ignition information. And I'm just trying to wonder how your model deals with understanding that.
So I totally agree that is a gray area, and we ask for specific. This capability and this requirement is us asking for the specific formulas of how the electrical corporation incorporates this. Again, we aren't doing any risk, we aren't doing any modeling here. These formulas here are in order to convey what we are asking the electrical corporation to define. So the overall risk is a combination of the input risk and of the ignition risk and the outage program risk. We require the electrical corporation to explain how they are integrated into an overall risk.
So do you have
not in the calculus sense?
Do you have any feel for how that's going to actually interact with the modeling they're doing already?
I don't feel comfortable answering that on the spot. I think that's something that we can.
Yeah, we'd have to get back to you on that.
Because I mean, for example, as I'm sure you're aware of, for example, PG&E models individual assets and individual vegetation types as drivers, and so models specific risks for specific drivers. And this is effectively asking for a cumulative assessment of that. Anyway, I've got one last place. Can we just go to slide?
Actually, if I may jump in, we asked for the separate analysis and the cumulative analysis and how the cumulative is reached from the separate. And we don't prescribe how that is done, but we require reporting on it, and we'll review it when we get the plan.
Okay. Okay, I appreciate that. Can we just go back to, my last question. Can we just go to slide 47, please? Okay, so help me understand the alternatives analysis here and what the intent, what energy safety intends to do with it. The way I hear what you've said to me is you are defining a project at a circuit segment level between two reclosers. So what happens if I have an alternative where the actual spatial difference, or I want to have a project that covers more than that circuit segment to get the same risk reduction? How does that analysis fold into this proposed structure?
So let me ask a clarifying question. So
Sure.
the scenario you're putting up, there's a circuit segment which is being studied for undergrounding. Instead of undergrounding, you would like to see the combination of putting covered conductor on not just that circuit, but also the surrounding circuits.
Circuit adjacent to it, so yeah.
Adjacents.
Say I could get the same risk reduction for doing 20 miles of covered conductor as I can for 10 miles of undergrounding, and I have which results in a substantially different cost benefit analysis.
That is not a scenario which we require reporting on.
Okay.
It is not forbidden, but you would see that you would not see that kind of difference at the project level. You would see it at the portfolio level. Again, when you say to achieve a comparable amount of risk reduction, you wouldn't possibly see that if you're only looking at one circuit. You'd have to look at it at a larger level. We do not have any levels between the project and the portfolio, but again, we would welcome comment.
Okay, so say at the portfolio level, I want to do 2,000 miles of covered conductor on 100 circuit segments rather than 1,000 miles of undergrounding on half as many circuit segments. How does that get reported at the project level?
So that is again not required in our current guidelines, but something we would welcome comment on.
Because I mean the regulations do require comparable reduction from all alternatives at both plan and project level. That's how I read it. I mean that's just me reading the legislation. So at least at the plan level, you would expect to have equivalent reduction in risk. I would hope that the energy safety is looking for equivalent reduction in risk between plan alternatives, because that's intimated in the actual legislation. That will provide comments on that as appropriate. I mean, I did previously in the workshops. So with a similar question, how are you handling hybrid projects where you may have a single circuit segment, but they may want to cover conductor half the segment and underground half the segment, but then your alternative might be just purely looking at covered conductor.
So we would again we can't prescribe how that's modeled, but we would expect that to be essentially counted as two alternate mitigations. Or suppose you wanted to look at mitigation A, mitigation B, and the combination of mitigation A and mitigation B, we would call that mitigation C, expect the same reporting on it as just one alone.
But then say that the risk, say the first mitigation is undergrounding, and then you get the most risk reduction for that. There is nowhere in this process, just to make me understand, there's nowhere in this process as I see where you would look at the cost benefits at this point. You'd just be looking at the risk reduction, and that is where energy safety is drawing out the line. Is that correct?
So for anything that goes through screen 3 where we see this, we would require the cost benefit because it would have had to have gone through screen 2.
But would you be making a decision on that, or are you just saying that's adequate? I'm just trying to understand.
I think this is a Jean or Kristen question.
Yeah, we're not approving projects. So what we're saying is you're following your plan, and that's what we're monitoring.
Okay, I appreciate that, Kristen. Thank you. So at no point, okay, I'll leave it at that. Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for very good questions, and yeah, I appreciate the feedback and the level of attention that's clearly being paid to the problem.
Are there any other questions? I don't see any other hands raised or questions. Just want to give everybody another minute to think about that.
There is Joseph Mitchell.
Oh, thank you. Joseph?
Good afternoon. Yeah, I was just wanted a little bit more clarification on how PSPS risk mitigation was handled, since you need to have more than one circuit segment, multiple circuit segments in tandem in order to achieve the goal for that. And if one is left out, then none of them actually, you don't get the benefit from any of them. So is that what you call the portfolio level? And that always has to be sort of kept coherent within the plan? How does that work?
Yeah, so yeah, great question. That's exactly the purpose of having portfolio level measurements and looking at the ablation studies, for example, of saying, if you have a whole line of circuits in a row and you underground all the downstream ones and you have an above ground one upstream, you shut it off, or then there's high one day, you end up with a PSPS, all the undergrounded lines get de-energized. And so that, yes, that is captured in the portfolio level analysis, and specifically looking at, say, the ablation studies and the collective alternative study, we would hope to capture these effects. In terms of keeping the portfolio consistent, yes, there is one portfolio at any time. It is all of the groups, or the group of all of the projects which are currently being considered. So as project timing changes or projects are taken out for various reasons, the portfolio may change. And again, we expect to get new risk scores for these collective analyses at every progress report update. And I think there was one more part of the question that I may have missed. If you
No, I think that I think you handled it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again for good questions.
Okay, and seeing no questions, let's move to the next section. Do we want to take another break, or do we want to just keep pushing through, do you think?
We are back on our original schedule, so since I have the next section, I wouldn't mind a couple-minute break to get some water.
Okay, how about we meet back in 5? Great, thanks everybody.
All right, welcome back everyone. Next major section is going to be on reporting. I'll kick it off by talking about some of the human readable data. Of course, with the modeling section that we've just gone through, there's a bunch of different studies we collected at different spatial and temporal levels and different scales. So it would be very overwhelming to put this all into a single spreadsheet and try to make sense of it. So we've got a couple different solutions for accessibility. The first of which is the portfolio cover sheet. So we will require a portfolio cover sheet in Progress Report 0, which we've mentioned before is somewhat of a beta test, and we anticipate having it in our future progress reports. And the goal of the portfolio cover sheet is to understand the portfolio level and system level, so really looking at the intermediate and macro level effects of the proposed mitigations. So first section will be a narrative justification outlining the portfolio, pointing out any key metrics or things that the Electrical Corporation thinks are particularly important to pay attention to in the evaluation of the portfolio. The second section is a deep dive on the key decision-making metrics. So there's a series of tables and figures that show the key decision-making metrics, both on a baseline and on and after the mitigations. So we are looking for system level and portfolio level profiles. So understanding, ranking all of the circuits from 1 to N, and showing what that profile looks like. Doing that both on the system level to understand the context of the portfolio within the system, and looking at it specifically on the portfolio level alone to understand the distribution of projects within the portfolio. And these are required for all 7 of our required key decision-making metrics. And for any additional key decision-making metrics proposed by the IOU, this triggers additional reporting again at the system and portfolio level, looking at both their distribution, but also higher order moments, looking at their average value, variance, and this kind of thing. The next section is a portfolio development section. This section looks at how the portfolio has changed over time. So in progress report 0, there won't be anything here because we won't have any other portfolio to have compared it to. But in future progress reports, we would expect an understanding of how the size of the footprint of the portfolio, how many circuits are being considered, has changed over time, how the baseline risk has changed over time, how the anticipated risk in year 25 after the plan has begun, how our understanding of that future date has changed. And lastly is again a list of circuits, which I'll detail a little bit more in the next slide, which we talk about our project index table. So next slide, please. So the project index table is a kind of an ancillary table which summarizes the most important human eye readable information for each project in the portfolio. So any data that appears here should appear in a different place in the tabular data submission, but it's organized here in a way that is nice for anyone to open it up in Excel and look at different projects. And if there's a specific project that they're interested in, they can look up the project reference sheet, which we'll talk about in a few slides. So this looks, this project index table asks for project ID, so we can uniquely identify the project, the portfolio ID, understand what other projects this project is being evaluated in relationship to, the circuit ID, where it's happening, circuit segment ID, if we have multiple segments in a single circuit, FIPS county codes to understand where the undergrounding project is taking place, project category, which of the 3 types of projects is it? Or is it none at all? So we do expect this for each circuit. The HFTD, is it in a high fire threat district, tier 1, tier 2, or none? So I should say this is all one table. I have ellipses here to show that I couldn't fit the entire table on one slide. So we continue on to the next slide. So next, yep, thank you. So then project risk reduction, project unit cost per overhead mile de-energized, unit cost per underground mile energized, total costs, cost benefit ratio for the undergrounding project. And then for each of the alternative mitigations considered, these will be additional columns in this table, whereas they're reported in the rest of our data as individual rows. So for each of the alternatives, give it a number, tell us what type it is, give us the amount of risk reduced, give us the unit cost per overhead mile de-energized, here underground mile energized, not for all alternatives unless it's some kind of hybrid project. specific instructions on that in Appendix C. Alternative project total cost, alternative project cost benefit ratio. And so once, if you've looked at this and there's a project you'd like more information on, but you're not ready to do a deep dive into all of the extensive data collection, we have our project reference sheets. Next slide, please. So again, the idea of the project reference sheets is not that someone's going to go in and read every single project reference sheets, but to have an idea of where you can understand more detail on a single project without having to go through the extensive data submission. So I think we showed part of this table earlier, looking for identification and context. So some IDs, some location information, the CPUC risk tranche, the CPUC risk rank, and then the risk rank for the 3 thresholds for our 3 project types, for the overall risk score rank, the ignition consequence rank, and the outage program likelihood rank. Next slide, please. Next, we have a table reporting important screen 2 information for the project and the alternatives, safety benefits, reliability benefits, risk reduction, unit costs, total costs, cost benefit ratio. Next slide, please. The next table is a screen 3 table. So we're looking at the work type, does it fulfill the project level standard, and then a summary of KDMMs which are of most interest, cumulative overall risk in year 60, cumulative wildfire risk in the next 60 years, cumulative outage program risk in the next 60 years, mean ignition consequence in the next 10 years, mean outage program likelihood in the next 10 years. Again, this is not the sum total of our requirements. This is just stuff that we surface in these projects reference sheets for accessibility reasons. Next slide. I believe this is, yeah, where I hand it off to Dr. Straw.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Clayton Strawn. I am also a research data specialist with the data division. And I'm going to talk about the specific pieces of data that we're going to be collecting as part of these progress reports that have been mentioned a couple times. So next slide, please. So there are 3 types of data that we're going to be getting. We're asking for each of these in different amounts, and I'll talk about all the different parts of it. But the 3 types that we're going to collect are 1, tabular data, so basically a spreadsheet of data that will be given, designed to be mostly, queryable by using code and looking through, all the different projects all at once or at different levels. So this will give us information on circuit segments, projects, and progression of the projects through different screens. And then there will be some that are more readable and kind of searchable versions of the detailed modeling information, which was what Stefan was just talking about. The second category of information that will be submitted to us is through JSON files. So, and I'll talk a little bit about why you are using those in a second, but these will be where we get the real details on the risk model. So details on the modeling system, such as the inputs and outputs that get affected by different mitigations considered, including undergrounding. And then also the detailed project level modeling. So the looking at individual projects and how each one has all their various KDMMs affected by the different mitigations considered. This is where we get the cumulative and instantaneous effects, the different kinds of studies, separate collective ablation. These are all going to be reported in this second JSON file. And then third, we're going to collect GIS data. This will tell us about projects that have finished scoping and are finally ready for construction. So once that has happened, then we also get information on where the assets are that are going to be removed and where the new assets are going to be placed in, so that we can use that to analyze what has happened after the fact, or when the projects are finished. So next slide, please. The tabular data is fairly straightforward, although there are a bunch of different pieces that are being collected. So there are 13 tables. We'll ask for them to be submitted as CSV files. So what these will do, so 1 second. Sorry, I had to close the door. So what these will do is the first one is the plan level tables. So these are static values that are submitted with the plan. These are basically just to be able to look up, okay, what were the thresholds that you had originally set? And so these will remain static all throughout the duration of the plan lifetime. Then there are a couple of other tables that will talk about the modeling evolution of the portfolio. So this will be basically showing the current snapshot of the portfolio and the evolution of the risk models as they get updated. And then you have a number of other tables that are tracking the specific projects through various screens. So these are in general order of how big they're supposed to be. So at the top, you have the full system of all the circuit segments in the utility territory, including ones that are not eligible for undergrounding under 884. We're asking for information on the entire utility territory, including risk models. So we have context for the risk values that we have inside, HFTD zones and just in the ones that are submitted as part of the portfolio. And then we have further and further information on things as they pass through the screens. So after they get through screen 2, they'll have more information on costs and benefits and information like that. And then as they pass through screen 3, they'll have gone through this much more detailed modeling dive of different alternatives and estimations of accumulated risk out to 60 years. Until we finally get to projects as they're being ready for construction. And that's the project construction table that's tracking things that are actually being worked on or about to be worked on. And then finally, we have this table 13, project index table, which we talked about before. This is the one that's sort of expected to be looked at most often by stakeholders who are interested in specific projects. It accumulates a bunch of information from other tables in a slightly more readable format. All right, next slide, please. So the second piece, and the one that's the real meat of the modeling that we collect, is the JSON data. So first of all, what is JSON? This is the first time that our department is requiring data to be submitted in a JSON format. So this is a lightweight text-based data format that can be easily modified and analyzed without any proprietary software. So this is an example of a screenshot of some JSON file format on the right. So essentially it looks kind of like code, but it's not really a code language. It's more like, a set of dictionaries, and it functionally acts like a pivot table as you can work it in Excel, but it's much more flexible. It can change what the columns are much more easily without, necessarily messing up scripts that are trying to read the data. So utilities will be required to publicly share this in the form of a spreadsheet. You can convert a JSON file to a spreadsheet, and we are requiring that those be posted, but these are sort of naturally designed to be used as JSON files. And I'll talk about each one of the ones we're asking for now. So next slide, please. The first JSON file talks about the risk modeling system. So what this will do is basically for each mitigation, the type that's being considered, we're asking for what are the inputs to all the different submodels that are affected. So Stefan was talking earlier about the report of all the submodels that they're going to submit. This is where we actually get in terms of numbers, like how much does each change affect each of these different submodels. Like, for example, the veg contact probability might drop by a certain percentage if you underground a line or if you put on coverage inductor. And then the utilities internal system, which they've reported on how it works, but they don't actually share the model's details or code or implementation with us. They operate that themselves. And then at the end, we ask, okay, what outputs are affected? So when you change something on a project, you decrease the probability of edge contact, and then at the bottom you go, okay, that means that the risk score drops by 50%, the ignition likelihood drops by 30%. So how does it change each of the KDMMs that we are tracking? So this will consider every mitigation that is being used by the utilities, and this is also where we will keep track of all the mitigations that they are proposing that they're going to compare against and how that would affect them. Next slide, please. So the second JSON file is the project level risk modeling file. So what this one is going to do is we have, for each project, we're going to look at the separate level and the collective and ablation studies level. So let's just look at one. The way that this flowchart works is that this leftmost thing is the most detailed, and then we repeat this multiple times. I'll talk about the different repeats in a second. But if we're picking a specific project and we're looking at the separate levels, so we're just looking at this project happening by itself, we're going to ask, okay, what is happening at the project level? So is this variable a cumulative variable, which means that we have to track both its instantaneous value and the value that accumulates over time? Or is it a non-cumulative value, in which case we're just tracking that value over time? We're tracking all these values at these specific times. So at 0, 5, 10, and then up to 60 years, which we has defined as the lifetime of the project. And then we're also going to look at this separate study at the portfolio level. So how much does changing this one project affect the entire portfolio? And we're going to get all those same values for this. So then we're going to do that again, but instead of looking at a single project happening, we're going to look at if the entire portfolio happens, what will happen to this project's modeling, and what will happen to this whole portfolio's modeling. And then we're going to do the same thing again for the ablation study, where we remove this project and do the rest of the portfolio. So we're going to collect all of this information for each of these 3 settings for this project. And then we're going to collect the same thing as if they did a different alternative for that project instead. So they have 2 alternatives they're required to do. We do not prescribe what those alternatives will be, although they will be defined in the previous JSON file where they talk about what does each alternative affect. So they go through and they analyze the alternatives in the same way and report all of the risk values or all the KDMMs at each of these years. All right, next slide, please. The last thing we're going to be collecting, as I mentioned, is spatial data. So this is mostly to flag that this will be required at some point for projects that once they've reached the status of being ready for construction, we're asking to have the information on the locations of where are the underground assets that are going to be created. So we're going to need to know about where the conductors are, the actual lines, as well as any assets and equipment that will be attached to them, you know, fuses and other equipment like that. I don't have the list in front of me, but so several other pieces as well. And then we'll also ask at the same time about the above ground assets that get removed. These may or may not be exactly 1-to-1 because sometimes undergrounding, it's easier to go around a certain thing or go in a slightly different direction. So we want to just track these as 2 separate layers. So we're going to ask about the existing above ground lines that are going to be de-energized and removed, and any assets that are going to be retired. And so that is the all of the data that we're collecting. And I think that is end of that slide. So next slide, please. All right, and then yeah, any questions about the data collection or other reporting?
So I see we have 2 questions. Arthur is first.
Thanks, Kristen. Can we just go back to slide 63, please? Oh,
Forward one more.
One more. Again, so just I'm probably going to sound a little bit like a broken record here, and I apologize for that, but I'm going to ask it again. In this instance, will you ask for the data at a project level, or the project will be a circuit? The granularity here is still going to be at the circuit segment level, is that correct?
Yes.
So how will an alternative that covers more than that circuit segment be represented at the system-wide, plan-wide level?
I would say that I think that the idea is that they are going to consider an alternative along just the same size as the original project. It may cover different parts of it, right? As we talked about before, undergrounding doesn't mean you underground every single foot of that line. It might mean you underground certain parts of it. And if you change those things, you'll be effectively changing the version of the project. As far as applying different mitigations, we are also asking them to consider, if they applied that mitigation to this project and they have some parameters on how much they apply, where it goes, is going to be defined in the more detailed narrative section of the modeling. So I think ultimately if they are going to have the pieces outside of the circuit folded in, they'll have to have explained that to us. But most likely, I think we're asking them just to report on doing this on things within the boundaries of the circuit segment.
So
Can I add to that, actually?
Sure,
Sorry.
please.
I would just like to say that this is a JSON per project. And so you would not see that comparison at the project level, but at the point where it splits project level, it also is the same reporting on the portfolio level. And that could be that should be reported in the portfolio level. And then when considering this hypothetical project or alternative that covers multiple circuit segments, the comparison that you would want to make would not be the project level comparison, but a comparison at the portfolio level of the different projects.
Okay. But how would that represent? I understand the comparison would be at the portfolio level. That makes total sense to me. How would that be represented at the alternative be represented at the project level though? Because you've got project alternative 1, alternative 2. It's very clearly that they're all at the same hierarchy.
So yeah, so this is a really good comment, I think, and we'd appreciate kind of further further comments on this in written comments. But as written right now, the guidelines would say just report it on the single project and on the portfolio.
Okay. The issue, okay, I'll just explain my underthinking that I want to go to the slide 64. You're holding the length of circuit constant by having a circuit segment, and you know the risk reduction purported for undergrounding is 99%. The risk reduction for vegetation management is 75%. Your undergrounding is always going to come out more successful if you hold it constant, but you're not actually going to achieve the requirements of the regulations, which, and I'm going to quote, a comparison of undergrounding versus overhead hardening of electrical infrastructure and wildfire mitigation for achieving comparable risk reductions. By holding the mileage constant, you're not going to get achievable risk reductions. You've got to let it fluctuate. That's my concern, and I will provide that as a comment. I have provided it previously. Moving on to slide 64. Are you doing so thanks for your responses. I appreciate where you are. Are you taking spatial data for specific projects for removal of overhead assets and the underground locations? Totally appreciate you doing that. Thank you for doing that. That's fantastic. Are you proposing to do any back validation between the location of the removed assets and the actual risk models from the utilities produce?
So I think that this isn't necessarily about spatial data as much as about how the portfolio evolves. But what we have a concept of the baseline, which is basically what has already been done, right? As this project, as this plan evolves from year 1 to year 5 to year 10, by the 5-year mark, they should have done some of these projects already. They are required to basically change the baseline. So they're not comparing to before we did any of these projects. They're comparing to would doing these projects still improve what's happening now after having affected, the system in certain ways. So yes, we are asking them to keep track of and account for the projects that have already been done, either through this program or through WMP programs or anything that's changed. They're using their current system of assets.
But are you validating that they've removed the assets that comport with the risk models that they're making the decision on?
I think that is a question for Kristen.
They have
Yeah.
to report as part of the project completion that lines have been removed and undergrounding has been energized. Is that what you're asking?
No, I'm asking whether they've removed the right lines. basically. They have a risk model that they've developed and they've made a decision on. That has got a spatial component to it, telling you where the highest risk locations are, the low risk locations are, and where they should be doing the undergrounding. What I'm asking is, are you validating that the locations that they're removing relate to the risk model on which they decided to make that decision?
So I
And
think that's a compliance issue, and we are not addressing that at this time. But I, again, appreciate the
Okay.
comment, and if you want to
Okay.
add that to your comments, that would be great.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Arthur, do you have any other questions?
No, that's me. Thanks, Brittany. I
Okay.
appreciate it.
Thanks. So the next person on the list is Jerome Candelaria. Hope I pronounced that correctly.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Hey there. Thanks. I've written one of my questions. It's do above ground assets removed include communication company and third-party assets? Will those be listed too? And related, will IOU communication assets, say, SATA antennas and the like, be included? So that's my first question. Then I'll have one other communications question. This refers to slide 64.
So maybe I can take the first part of that. On the project reference sheets, there is a section for the ECs to list the other utilities which are on the poles.
So I guess that leads me to the next question. On the project reference sheet overview, there's an opportunity or a requirement for the electric company to indicate whether any communications company or other third party have equipment on the poles where the circuit is currently located. I'm wondering, what level of granularity are you seeking there? Is a yes or no answer sufficient? For example, yes, there are telecommunications facilities located on the circuit, in question, or is there an expectation that there be any more granular information provided, for example, pole level or something like that? And if there is any granularity there, will it be reflected anywhere except in beyond this text narrative on the sheet overview?
So I'll just answer for that. We kind of developed this requirement looking at the PUC guidelines and how they're handling the same situation. So right now it does ask for the specific entities that have the lines. Does not specifically, the guidelines don't specifically ask for a level like that pole level of granularity.
So we could conceivably see a yes or no answer here for the whole circuit?
You would yes or no, and then a list. It sounds like you're concerned that the lines aren't always don't always match the entire circuit segment, and they might be partial. Is that right?
Well, it's the more general concern. The discussion in this portion of the workshop had to do, I think, with making information more available, and
So you're
trying
okay.
to figure out what information will actually be available.
So regardless of the data collected, what is going to appear in the project reference sheet? Is your question, I think.
Yeah. The level of expectation you have. I'm not suggesting what that level should be. I'm just trying to figure out what to expect. How to interpret section 2.8.7.2.
So Clayton or Stefan, do you know what we have currently?
I would have to read exactly what we have before trying to provide an interpretation. I think this would be a great question for next week after we have a little more time to digest what exactly is being asked.
I will say that as far as spatial data, we are not collecting information at like the specific pole or specific line level of anything that's not owned by the utility. So we do collect just a general, text narrative of like of other things that are on the poles in that segment or in that circuit segment, but we're not collecting like, okay, where are the specific places where there is third-party equipment?
Will that data go into any sort of analysis, or you collected for the purpose of what?
Mostly
Kristen,
mostly for reporting that it's there. Part of the guidelines that the PUC has put out suggest that the utilities need to have a plan for any telecom or other utilities that are attached to poles that get removed or lines that get removed as a result of undergrounding. That's not what we do specifically, so we're asking for the information so it can be tracked, but we're not analyzing whether or not a project should or shouldn't happen as a result of telecom communication stuff being impacted.
Thanks for that. Okay, appreciate
Sure.
it.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any other hand raised or questions in the Q&A chat. So maybe if we could, Val, go to next slide. The last slide. Yes, thank you. Okay, so thank you all very much for participating in this and for the great questions. I know it's a lot of information and it's fairly dense. So that was one of the reasons that we wanted to do another session next week that would be really driven by your questions now that you've had a longer time to kind of contemplate all this. So that'll be next Wednesday from 1 to 3. If you get a chance, if you think about questions you want to send in advance, that would be much appreciated. We've got the electrical undergrounding plans at energysafety.ca.gov email address for you to do that. Also, just a reminder again that comments are due on the 29th of May and reply comments are due on the 10th of June. And with that, I think we are adjourned. And again, thank you all very much for your attention and your comments. They're greatly appreciated.
Kristen, there
Yes.
seems to be a question from an anonymous attendee in the Q&A.
Okay. So let me read that out. Will the large electrical corporations be required to indicate whether the poles will be removed as part of their undergrounding efforts when capturing the inventory of above ground assets being removed? I am not sure the answer to that question, but I will tee that up for next week and we can come back to you with an answer. So I'm not seeing any other questions. Again, thank you all very much for your attention and your questions. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you again next week. Take care.